So that if you'd say you're starting out working on sustainability for the first time, my hope was that they could use my findings and give companies confidence that you're not the first who will ever do this.
Yeah.
You're actually part of this group of people who want to do the right thing.
Welcome back, everybody. Rich Brubaker, founder of Collective Responsibility, here today with another episode of the Sustainable Ambassador Podcast. Through this podcast, I'm speaking with global leaders in academic, nonprofit, government, talking about their work in sustainability. In this episode, I'm extremely excited to be joined by Janice Lao, who is the VP of Global ESG at Helen of Troy and a senior associate at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership. She's a longtime friend, and over the last 20 years, she's worked across the field of corporate sustainability as head of sustainability for several publicly listed companies. In recent years, she's also co-authored 2 books with her children. If that weren't enough, she's completing her PhD in sustainable education at Prescott College, where she's researching her role on boards and sustainability. And I wanted to bring her on to talk about what she's been working on, what she's seeing, and what she's finding value in. So welcome to the show, Janice. It's really an honor to have you speak with us about not just your incredible career and the research you're working on, but as a starting point, would you mind introducing yourself and what was it that led you more than 20 years ago to even start this career?
Yes, thanks, Rich, for having me. So glad to be here. Thank you again. So I started off when I was 18. My parents were actually political activists. And so I grew up seeing them pretty much giving up their life for their beliefs, which that was pretty much the norm for me. And then I thought, well, what is that thing for me? But I found it when I was 18. And back then, Rich, you'll probably laugh, I was reading Reader's Digest because my father gave it to me. And then I read about this Indian environmental engineer, and he was talking about what he was doing to reduce pollution in the factory. And I was just so taken by it. Then that was it. I was going to be like, this is what I'm going to do. And I took environmental science and I did economics as well, mostly to please my Asian parents. And then I studied in Oxford, did my master's there, and then I did my internship at World Resources Institute. That was my first time to actually see the levers of business being used for good. So that's how I ended up being in the field of, back then, CSR and all the other terms we've used since then.
Yeah. In that time, what are some of the major roles that you've had and how have things changed over the last 20 years?
Back then, there weren't a lot of in-house sustainability teams. And then eventually they started building sustainability teams because I was already one of the first consultants working in the industry. No surprise, you'd be the one they would hire because you have the most experience, right? And so I moved from consulting to in-house sustainability. One of the first ones I worked for was Cathay Swire, which is Cathay's owner, and then MTR, Peninsula, and now Helen of Troy. What has changed? Definitely the teams have grown. The highest role that you can find in sustainability team either reports to what we call in the US named executive officers, or you would report to the board. But back maybe 15 or 20 years, that was unheard of. We would just be like the tactical, like regulatory people who would just deal with permit. I still cannot
Why
believe.
Is that? What's driven this from like a cute, nice to have, or the lawyers told us we need you, to something strategic for almost every company that's publicly listed now has an ESG, sustainability, CSR, D&I, individual, team?
I think we've gotten a better grasp of the issues that we are trying to manage. And a lot of these issues have some level of connection to finance or economics or to the business model. Back then, when I first started, it was just simply, we have an environmental permit and we just need to comply with that permit. It was just that simple. But now it's things like, it could impact my supply chain. I can't sell this to this retailer. Or back when I was at Cathay, some of our biggest clients would be like JP Morgan, the banks, right? And they would be like, well, if I'm buying this many flights from Cathay, I need to make sure that your flights are fuel efficient. It's permeated almost every part of the business. From your consumer, your customer, your supplier, how you going to get into new markets. I would say it has more tentacles now than it did when I first started.
And why? Like what's driving that?
Definitely, we no longer live in a world where there is a country that or a region that doesn't have a climate policy. The fact that we have a better understanding of society's impact on the environment from maybe 20 years ago when I first started to today, there's a lot more companies who have included it in the way they do business. So if you don't have XYZ on sustainability, you just can't do business with them.
And through that time, how do you think brands or companies what's their relationship to the responsibility that they see to solve these issues? Like, are they actually taking on the idea that we're part of the problem, or is it something more forced, like still that we're seeing it's a compliance issue, we need to do this for the money, we need to do this for the market?
The best way to put it is that it's like a layering of these different factors. In the past, it was just regulatory, right? Maybe like 20 years ago. Maybe 5 years after the first year I started, it became another factor, and then another factor, and then another factor. And those different factors are things like you've got the younger generation entering the workforce. I'm Gen X, so the millennials, the Gen Zs, and then the new alpha generation, right? They have a different way of viewing things and a different way of working or a different set of expectations. So you have that both as an investor and as a buyer, right?
Exactly.
So you have all of these expectations. And so it influences, or I would say, encourages companies or businesses to think differently than compared to how they operated maybe 30 years ago. It was obviously just a different world, but also now you have so many of these factors at play. And also, we actually see the impacts of climate change now more than ever. So I think that personal experience and all these other things I mentioned, all those factors piled together has created this environment where companies not only feel that they're responsible, but it's just part of doing business.
That kind of brings me to the last 3 or 5 years, which I would say is probably like the gigantic hot fudge sundae of coming together. I won't say accepting, but definitely adopting things like net zero, ESG, D&I, science-based target. Like, you hear this regularly in the business community, part of the financial markets, and now you're hearing obviously some measure of pushback. And I'm wondering, what's the last 3 or 5 years for you been like as a professional in this space? Is it easier to get things done? Is it
the first 15 years, if you like? The question was, why do we need to do it? And in the past 3 years and 5 years, it's changed to, how are we going to do it?
Yeah.
And I think what's, for me personally, I think I've gotten better at articulating precisely what I want. Because in the past, I had a really, really hard time explaining to people I work with, particularly senior management or the board, what it is, because I spent most of the time explaining the basics.
Right.
Does that make sense? Like, here are the definitions, here are the concepts, and then that's already 1 hour. Now it's literally like, I don't have to explain a lot of these concepts because they sort of understand it through their own lens and their own filter, and that's fine. But it's not like I'm starting from zero. I have more time to talk about building the business case, getting buy-in, understanding what the potential barriers could be. I didn't have that time to do that my first 15 years. And you'd think it'd get easier, but actually now that you're being asked, how are you going to do it? Oh, there's so many options.
With that as a background, the last 12 to 18 months, there has been quite a bit of pushback in terms of anti-ESG, anti-sustainability, anti-woke, anti-D&I, and for me, a lot of that just comes down to not understanding the value of these investments. And I think that's where you spent your time researching this. So I'd really love it if you would introduce some of the research that you're doing as part of your PhD, and what are the core questions that you're seeking to answer through this research?
Essentially, my research is about trying to find out what the prevalent practices are in companies that are highly ranked in sustainability indices. And the way to do it was obviously use the most publicly accessible data, which happens to be, and still happens to be, corporate night. I wanted to focus on governance and how they were communicating their sustainability commitments, including how they structured their sustainability teams. I was interested in that leadership governance point of view. Again, mostly because my bias was, this is my experience. I work a lot with these people, so I was just curious. And also trying to answer that question, I often get asked, what does good look like? What do other what other companies do in terms of these types of structures? And I kind of had an answer, but I could never give them like 58% of the companies had X. I could never do that.
Sure,
and when you're speaking at that level, it matters when you have that sort of data. So that's the reason I started with that research.
When it came to like corporate nights and the information, what's the kind of data that you are using to understand these different buckets of, I guess, or different angles of approach?
So what I did was I measured things that weren't in the corporate nights index. I just used the list from Corporate Knights because, they're saying these are the top 100 most sustainable companies, blah, blah, blah.
Okay.
And then I just took out the US companies from 2005 all the way to 2023. I looked at 13 indicators, maybe 2 of them, Corporate Knights or any like the MSCI, the S&P, they were measuring, but majority of the 13 was never measured in any of the ESG rating scores. And that was critical because I didn't want to be like, of course, they're going to show prevalent practices because they're listed in these indices. I didn't want people to say that. So I had to take that out. The critical part of my research was looking at what they were saying in their 10Ks and their proxy statements, which is very different from what you would say in a sustainable report. Sustainable reports are very flowery, but the level of expectations when it comes to saying what you need to say in these legally mandated documents there's just the consequences are so much severe if you are exaggerating what you're saying.
Right.
And so I use that that stick that the SEC had on companies to be like, well, what did they actually say?
What's the gap in language then between a 10K or proxy statement and a flowery sustainability report? Are you able to say that sustainability reports are much more in line with what they're saying in these proxy statements? Like, is that gap kind of narrowing over time?
I don't think all sustainability reports are flowery. I think that's just our stereotype, right? There's a bit more leeway for you to use certain types of words or be a bit more markety in your language, but in reality, you still need to have the same. You still need to ensure that whatever you're sharing to the public is accurate, right? Again, as I said, because that is the requirement, especially if you're listed in the US. So what I found was if you wanted to just get straight to the point and be like, what exactly are you saying? Read the 10K of the proxy. And if you want to be like, okay, great, you now told me exactly what you're trying to do. So I want a bit more detail. Like, are you working on, if you want to go deep into several rabbit holes, read the sustainability report. But if you want to be like straightforward, I need the answer, look at the 10K and the proxy.
And from your research so far, are there some common principles that you say define leadership in this space right now? Like,
yes, so definitely 80% of the companies of that 82 companies I looked at had a climate change target. But if you broke that down to 50% of the 82 had an SBTI approved target, while the 30% did not. For several reasons, things like, and I think I'm not sure if it was Intel or IBM who said this, I can't remember which company. They felt that the SBTI was a bit too constraining for them because they wanted to do more. And then the others were just like, they could not see, they just felt that their sector was not well represented using the SBTI methodology. So basically, one of the key findings I found was they aligned to a third-party standard. When I was doing research, it's critical because you don't want to be, it's like you're creating your own thing and then you're checking your own work. Do you know what I'm saying? Like being able to align with a third party keeps you honest and kind of encourages you to follow the industry approach as opposed to just doing what you think is right, beneficial only for your company. Interesting enough, majority of their CSOs or heads of sustainability did not report to a marketing team. They reported either, and I called them the named executive officers. So the named executive officers are these people you list in your 10K, and you're saying these are the most important people in this company. And majority of of heads of sustainability or CSOs were reporting. They were either a named executive officer who were named in the 10K, or they were reporting directly to the named executive officer.
Did a lot of them report to legal officers then? Because I
find either legal officer, the COO, some reported to the CEO. They're all the chief legal officer, the COO, the CEO. They're mostly named executive officers anyway. But I didn't look at like what percentage of them reported CLO. I was more interested in the named executive officers as a group. Majority of these companies had boards that were specifically dealing with sustainability. They were reporting. Again, no surprise. That's why I'm able to get this information because they reported. So the things that we already knew as sustainability practitioners, we just didn't have the data to back it up. So now I can actually say, 75% of these companies are reporting on their 10K proxy and their sustainability report. Like 80% of these companies have a climate change target, a long-term climate change target. So that if you'd say you're starting out, starting out in a company that's working on sustainability for the first time, my hope was that they could use the list, my findings, and be like, hey, look, hopefully give companies confidence that you're not the first who will ever do this.
Yeah.
You're actually part of this group of people who want to do the right thing. I think it's just a human nature again, right? And again, there's research around that if you want, not, I wouldn't call them the laggards, but not necessarily the leaders. If you want to mainstream them and move them, you have to show that there's a safe space for them to do so. And in order to create that safe space, you have to say you're not the only one who's ever done this before. You're not necessarily sticking your neck out and
Is
taking a
that the
huge
main
risk.
takeaway? Would you say that's the main takeaway for anyone who to read your research then? Like if you bring this together, what are some key takeaways? Like you have a firm that hasn't started or one that's early in the path. What can they gain from this research that helps them, or what's the implications?
Yeah, and so essentially is that they now have a list of practices that they can I'm not saying they have to meet every practice. Every company is unique, obviously. But my hope is that a lot of the companies who are just starting out will find some confidence in at least picking maybe 3 of the 13 that's on the list. And I also looked at how long they were listed. These 82 companies were listed in the CK100, and it didn't matter. There was one that was only listed once, and they had the same prevalent practices to someone like HP, who's been in the list for the whole time CK100 existed.
Right.
And that blew my mind, because I always thought that, oh, you have to be there for 5 years. That's just my bias again. 5 years, somebody maybe have told me that. 7 years, 5 years. But then these practices, you can just do it today. You don't need to wait a year after you've implemented sustainability in order to do all of this.
Can you, through this research, kind of identify which ones bring value to the company or which ones lead to a better performance in the space?
That one I did not have time to do. And my hope is, and that was one of the things I said in my research is one of the first where I've been able to put a number next to what is the percentage of companies doing X.
Yeah.
And then hopefully that 13 indicators, I've narrowed it down to 13. Hopefully in the next, I might do the research, someone else might want to do it, then they can start making those correlations, right? Okay. Because before this list, you had to come up with this list first in order to decide, okay, what sort of correlations am I going to be making? Yeah. So that was so think about it. That's the next step, I would say. But one thing I found in the 500 references I read was there is currently no study, like a huge body of work that says sustainability is bad for business. Because I think we're always trying to prove the other side, which is sustainability is good for business.
Right.
But also there's no body of work, like this rich body of work. Maybe there's one or two, but like this rich, irrefutable body of work that says sustainability is just ultimately bad for business. There is none of that research.
Well,
I think we forget that, right? That's it. We always want to prove the positive, but also nobody's proved the negative.
I feel like that's the wrong approach sometimes. Like we should be proving the opposite and saying this is why we should be doing more of it, because what's the harm if you're actually still solving the market, you're ahead of the regulations, you're really in a leadership position. Just because you can't prove the value today doesn't mean there's no value.
And that's the point I made. I was like, we're so focused on proving the positive relationship. Nobody has proved irrefutably. I don't want to say nobody. There's not an irrefutable body of work to prove the negative. So even neutral is good enough.
So I have a few questions to wrap this up. Where do you see things going forward? You've been in this for 20 years. You've seen the iterations, the layers of the cake growing thicker. Where do we go from here? What are some topics that you think are going to be irrefutably positive? What are the ones that you think are going to be, we have to do it no matter what? What are things that be commonly adopted because it's neutral, but it makes sense?
I hope for the day when we don't call it sustainable business. It will just be the way we do business. And I think we're getting there. I know I don't want to be like Pollyanna about the whole thing, but it does feel kind of that way. That is my hope, that we stop putting sustainable in front of a noun, and that's just how we're going to do it.
So I'm going to try and make a personal jump here and say, in a sense, for sustainability professionals, we're constantly trying to find our charter as well. Like, what's our value? How do we deliver on it? And I'm curious, what do you think, be it through this research or through your own experience, what are the skills and tools you feel are key to success for an in-house sustainability professional to develop and deliver their own charter?
Empathy. Listening more than responding to respond, because I think we always want to say I'm right, and I always tell people you already know you are. You do not need the external validation. It's now figuring out, how do I meet people where they are? And because changing hearts before changing minds, that's always what I say to my team. Because again, you can look at my data and be like, go to your board and be like, this is what we need to do. But if they don't trust you,
Yeah.
my data, my research is useless. That's
Yeah.
the thing, right? So a lot of it is still empathy. A lot of it is still that's I think one of the most critical skills if you're going to be working in this field, especially with all the things that are happening, all the changes.
Yeah.
It'll just help you kind of not react to a lot of the trends that's going on, and always being able to sit and be like, okay, what exactly am I trying to do here? And being able to articulate that and being empathetic to what's going on around, and understanding that people are not where you are.
And if you were going to give career advice to a young professional or student who's interested in developing their career in sustainability, what 2 or 3 pieces would you give them to help them get a little bit further along in their path?
The passion is important, but not enough.
Right.
So I do tell people I love their passion, but they must learn the technical skills, like carbon footprinting, life cycle analysis. Not all of them, but at least some of the technical skills, right? Engaging with people, and learning that skill of engagement, and then just always trying to figure out trying to put themselves. It's kind of related to empathy, but my third advice would be trying to put themselves in the shoes of the other person that you're trying to convince, and trying to understand, well, what would motivate this person, and how can I connect what I'm trying to ask them to do with that motivation. Because I would say most of the time people have the right intentions. It's just trying to figure out where to hook your ask to that intention, and that is a skill.